On this channel, I specialise in making really complex looking images easy to create. So just follow along with my step-by-step tutorial of this painting and you will amaze yourself. Okay, I'm using the app Procreate on the iPad Pro, but you can probably apply the techniques and process to a different tablet or another app that you may happen to be using. But within Procreate, I'm using an A4 canvas. The default settings, so that is 297 by 210 millimeters at 300 dpi. In terms of the brushes I'm going to be using, I use all of the preset brushes. So if you have the app, you'll be able to find them yourself. So I use within airbrushing the soft brush. During this tutorial, the medium brush within airbrushing 2. Within sketching, I'm going to use the 6B pencil. Within artistic, I'm going to use the leatherwood brush. And within organic, I'm going to use the rainforest brush. In terms of the colours, I've already pre-selected some colours in this area. If you look down in the video description, you'll find each of the codes that you can type them in here one at a time, press enter, the colour appears up here, and then you can tap it together yourself. Alternatively, next to the codes is a link that takes you to my Patreon page and you can download the colour file for free there. If you enjoy this kind of tutorial, please make sure to give this video a thumbs up, hit the subscribe, and don't forget the bell notification to make sure you are notified of all my future videos. With all that said and done, let's get started. So we have our A4 canvas, layer 1, going to go to my colours, first colour on the top row. I'm going to drag from the circle in the right corner and let go, and it flood fills that entire layer and it just gets rid of that intimidating white start. Go to my layers, click the plus symbol to create another layer, go back to my colours, the second blue. If I go to the colour disc, you'll see where it's situated and you can see how it compares to the one. So it's pretty much the same kind of blue but much lighter. And I'm going to go back to my airbrushing and the soft brush. I'm going to put the size at about 25% and 100% opacity, and about 2/3 of the way up I'm going to do a line across like that, and then I'm just going to take out this top corner as well. I'm going to leave a little area here that's darker just to create a slight variation in the sky. I'm going to go now to my adjustments, the Gaussian blur, and I'm going to blur it in to about the 60%. I'm going to go back to my layers and click the plus symbol to create another layer, go to my colours and pick the third colour along, stay on the soft brush, but I'm going to reduce the size down to 15% size and stay on 100% opacity. This time just slightly above halfway, I'm going to do another line across, doesn't need to be particularly straight. I'm going to go to the adjustments, Gaussian blur, and blur it in anyway. I'm going to blur it into about the 50%. We'll create another layer, layer 4, go back to my colours and use the fourth colour along. We're going to stay on the soft airbrush, or soft brush within airbrushing rather. But we're going to reduce it down to 10% size, stay at the 100% opacity, and now about halfway, do a line across, and again, adjustments, Gaussian blur, blur it to about the 40%. Now we may adjust some of these, but it just gives us a foundation, a starting point for some of the now more textured areas and details. Create another layer, layer 5. I'm going to go to the blue colour here, which is the 6th colour along. I'm going to be using now the organic rainforest brush, and I've set it to 2% size and about 30% opacity strength. And from this left side, I'm just going to tap in some textures, move the brush around, move the Apple Pencil around, and just allow it to add in there in a really fragmented and quite loose way, up and down, as I'm moving generally in a sweeping motion, but I'm allowing it to just sort of randomly scatter in there a little bit. I can allow it to form larger shapes too, but I am being pretty random in the way that it just sort of builds in there and taps in there. I can allow for just a couple here and there that are breaking away, and I can go back over it as well. I like to build up in some areas, be a bit more sparse in some, but in other areas I can block it in. That'll do for one of the shapes. Maybe I'll do another one below it Again, let's really start to block it in some areas. Allow it to become more sparse in some, and then build up in other areas too, something like this. Perhaps I'll come for another block of cloud over here. Perhaps I'll even put it up to a larger size, so 6% is really quite big, just to get a larger mass in here perhaps initially. Something like this. Then I'll reduce it back down, go probably for the 2% again, and I can start adding some finer tuned edges and details as we go around this shape. I'm going to use the Gaussian blur in a moment, just to really soften it in. Does help, but this is a really, for me, I feel it's a really good starting point. It just gets you over the sort of anxiety about creating textures from scratch. It gives you something to work with, and then you can just, you can go in with another brush, and I will show you that, and go in with something like the airbrush, and you can start to refine it and control it exactly as you want, but it just gives you a starting point really. So I'm going to put it up to maybe something like about the 3% now, and just some lighter taps as it goes off the edge over here, maybe some just down here in this area too, and I might even have another block of it over here too, something like this. I can go over it again. Okay, so I'm going to go to the adjustments, the Gaussian blur again, and I'm going to blur that in to about the 6%, and it really has softened it in, but it hasn't got crucially rid of the kind of shapes and the textures that we're looking for. I'll come back to that and add a little bit more refinement and detail, but I'm going to create another layer, and I'm going to put it underneath layer 5. I wanted to get the really dark colours in first. Now I'm going to add some slightly lighter ones, and they will merge together, but I just really wanted to get the impactful dark colours in there first. So layer 6 is underneath layer 5, go back to my colours. I'm going to go for the second from the right, which if you look on the colours is a kind of blue, but it is very greyed out and quite pastel. And I'm going to continue the technique with the same brush, still set to 2, well, again, let's put it down to 2% size and 30% opacity strength. And with this rainforest brush, I'm going to continue to maybe add in some other textures just behind. So the two colours now will start to bring this effect together, perhaps just fill in some of the corner up here as well. Continue with some of this texture. Gaps are important as well, so don't just completely fill it in. Leave some areas where they don't quite connect. That can be really important. Perhaps I'll put it up a little bit more, so more about the top end of 3%. I can just start to fill in now. Maybe just do some longer strokes to fill in across. And I'm going to take this all the way across to the other edge, something like this. Allow it to become more of a sweeping set of clouds, a bank of clouds that really just sweeps across like this. Then go to the adjustments, Gaussian blur, blur it in again. This time I'm going to blur it in to about 10% initially. So we don't really have any refinement yet, but obviously we have the chance to go in and just sharpen it up a little bit too. I might just go back to my layer 5, go back to the blue colour I was using initially, but I'm going to change brush now back to the airbrushing and soft brush. I'm going to have to reduce the size down to about 2% and also the strength down to about 30%. And I can use the shapes that I've got and perhaps just refine them a little bit, put them exactly where I want them to be. I actually feel that the brush is too big at that size, so I'm going to put it down to the lowest part of 2% because there is quite a big margin between the low 2 and the high 2, so I'm going to put it down to the lowest part of 2%. And then I can just go in and just really sharpen up some of the edges where I feel it needs a little bit more clarity. We've already got some shapes suggested for us, so that makes our job that much easier now, just to go in and really give it some sharpness where we feel we want it and where we feel it needs it. You don't have to do it on everything. Obviously, the beauty of clouds is that it kind of does go in and out of focus in certain areas. So some bits will appear soft, and then other bits you'll get a sharper, harder edge to it. So use this change of brush and clarity to your own advantage. So I'm following pretty much the shapes that I've already established with other textural brush. I'm using it as my inspiration now to go in there and just make it more like the kind of detail that I want. And that includes, now I've got a sense of the kind of textures that could be there. I'm creating my own breakaway shapes. I might turn the opacity down even further actually, to about 15%. And that way it's going to be something I have to still build up. Although it is sharper, it requires me to go over it quite a number of times to start laying down that texture and those marks. Now I can really go to town with some of these breakaway textures now. I can just add many more. And this is the kind of area that does take a little bit more time. It's not really something a brush will do 100% for you, but I actually really quite enjoy adding manual texture like this. Once you've got to a certain point and you're feeling quite confident that it's kind of working, then manually applying this kind of texture I think is pretty satisfying and good fun. I've always been a massive enthusiast of drawing and painting anyway, in traditional forms and now digital, so I've realised that if this is a new pastime to you, that some of these parts of the tutorials or the painting process can seem quite laborious. But I do recommend that you just settle down, come to grips, come to terms with the fact that it really is going to be a little bit of a meditative and also time-consuming process, and just try and enjoy that side of it. Okay, I will blur it in just a hint more. I know I have made it a little bit clearer, but I'm just going to blur it in to the 2% should do. Just softens it just a little bit and brings them together. I feel like I want to add a slightly brighter blue to certain areas, so I've got this second blue that I've gone to. Stay on my soft brush, but I'm going to put it up to about 3% size and really quite low at about 5% strength opacity. Now I can just go over some of these areas and just add a slightly lighter blue tone. It brings them together even more, softens the two techniques and brush strokes together just that little hint more, and I'm just kind of merging them together almost, something like this. And there's some areas where you can get more of a hazy kind of cloud shape, where you kind of one blends into another, and you can use this second blue to do something like that. I find it will work, and that's helped with this particular area. I'm going to put it up in strength to about 10% and down to the 2% again, and maybe for this section of cloud I'm just taking my cues from the other section. I'm just going to do this one a bit more manually and just start to build it up by hand rather than relying upon a textured brush. And you can use combinations, and I do recommend that you have a go at doing that. And again, maybe it's just some more breakaway textures here and there as well. I'll go a little bit more into this one too. Maybe put it up to about the 5%, and I can just go in and soften some of this one in just a hint more. Back down again to the lowest part of 2%, and just like I was doing before, sharpen up some of these edges. It's quite nice to have a variety of different hints and tones of blue, ever slightly different tones and hues. It's just going to give it more of a dynamic feel. If you had it all exactly one type of blue, it really isn't going to be very natural looking. So building it up now with a couple of different darknesses and hues. So that will do for the dark layer initially. I'm going to go back to layer 6 that was underneath, and also back to these colours here. So the second from the right will stay on the soft brush at 2% size, and I'll keep it at the 10% opacity. And I'm going to continue adding similar kind of textures, maybe the lower part of 2% if it isn't already there. And I can add some of these textures. And now that I've started using it, I realise the 10% opacity is doing something, but perhaps it could be a little bit stronger in some areas. I'll just initially add a little bit with this colour first. I can fill in some of the gaps. It is a lighter and more subtle effect, so you can really just be a bit freer in the way that you use it. Don't worry too much. But then I can also put the strength up to about 25%, something in that area. And I can go to town a little bit more on these upper regions, so that this whole area of cloud, kind of the texture and the colours all seemingly merge together a little bit more. Remember, some of those gaps might be quite nice, and we could always make more of those in a moment too. But just tap in some different textures and see how we go. Now, clouds are not the easiest of things to do, so take your time. If this is the first go at doing clouds, then give yourself a break. If it's not absolutely exactly how you'd want it to be, then don't worry, it doesn't need to look exactly the same as mine. I think as long as you're using the kind of the colours and the textures and the lighting in a similar area to where I'm showing you, then overall it's going to work at least in part. Clouds and this kind of texture is something that does take time to build up and build confidence into, so do not worry too much. I'm just adding a little bit more breakaway textures in this bottom area too, something like this. Maybe go to this even lighter colour, and I can build in some of these as well, just to vary it up a little bit. Again, you know, remember to, I think, usually use a couple of different tones, even when the overall effect is fairly standard and consistent. I think just using slightly, you know, different tones, different hues can really just build in a little bit more life. Okay, I'll stay on this layer, but I'm going to use the darker blue again, and I'm going to have it at the 2% size and down again to about the 10%. And there are areas here where I can just, in fact 10% is too much, let's put it back down to the 5 again, as we were doing. It is a very dark colour compared to other things, so I'm just going to use it now just to subtly work in some shadow areas, even within these lighter colours. So you don't need to overdo this, it is a subtle element, but as I was saying, it just merges these two areas together. So it's not so obvious which is how it's going into the foreground and what's going into the background. It just kind of brings them together in some areas, which I think is nice. Okay, I'm going to go back to layer 4, which is underneath the dark clouds. I'm going to go back to my colours, and I'm going to use this lighter colour, which was third in on the top row. Again, using my soft brush, set to 5% size and about 10% strength. And just at the bottom section of this cloud, I'm going to build on some slightly lighter colour, not too much. And then I can also swap it to the lighter colour here, which is the 5th. And I haven't used this colour particularly yet, but I'm just going to bring in some of that warmth to this lower area. Something like this. Okay, I'm going to create another layer above layer 4. So now this is layer 7, but it's sandwiched above layer 4 and underneath layer 6 and 5. So the order is a bit out of number order, but if you follow closely and follow what I'm doing, then you'll get it right. So layer 7 is above layer 4. I'm going to go to my layer. I'm going to change, however, the N, which stands for normal within the blend mode, so I'm going to change it to add, which here changes it to an A. I'm going to go to my colours, I'm going to go to this red colour on the second row, and I'm going to put my brush size to 4% size and 10% strength. It's really going to be quite strong, so I'm just building it in now from this side, and I'm building it in gradually, building in some light from this side. I'm only gliding over the screen quite lightly, allowing the luminosity to build up, something like this. You don't need to overdo this at all, and allowing it just to merge down a little bit too. And I'm just going over it. Now I could press hard, and you can see that really stands out more dramatically than what I've just been doing. So it is a combination of only 10% opacity, but also pressing on lightly too. I'm going to stay on the same layer, but go to this orange colour. I'm going to reduce the size of the brush to 2%, but stay crucially at the 10% opacity. And within some of these areas now, I'm just going to build in some sections of this lighter colour, and it will just give the hint that there's really a concentration of the sun. Although it's set, it's still reflecting and just highlighting edges of some of these clouds just a little bit. And we can have some of this impact just tracing across the sky a little bit too. It doesn't have to be isolated only to there, although it will be there predominantly. We can have it just a hint, some of the areas over here too, just a note of it. And we can always go back in there and really concentrate it and make more of it. Something like this. I'm just going to go back to the red color again. I feel like I want to ramp that up a little bit, so I'm going to put it at about the 4% size and about 10% opacity. I just want to go over that a little bit more. I don't want to overdo it, but I certainly want a bit more. I'm going to have other features here a little bit lower down anyway, so I don't need to worry too much about what's going on in this region. What I might do is go to the very top layer and create another layer above, and I'm also going to change the N to the add in the blend mode too, and I might just add a little bit more up in this area so it softens in the impact above as well as below those layers. I think it's building up that really nice warm contrast, and quite nicely actually by doing that. It is adding a lot more light to the scene, which is no bad thing. So I've gone over it quite a few times there. Again, you build it in so that it looks enough for you. It might not be exactly the same as me, but you can see the overall effect that you're aiming for. I'm going to create another layer on top of that, and I'm going to go back to my colors here on the top row, so second from the right again. Importantly, we're back to the normal blend mode, not the add again. I'm going to have it on the soft brush. I'm going to put it down to about 2% and about 20% opacity. And just to contrast with some of these really nice warm tones now, I can just have a little bit more of these darker shapes cutting in as well. Now I'm tapping them in, having some slightly more broken shapes in here, something like this. Allowing it to build up and bunch together. Let's block your forms. You decide how much is enough for you. And just a little bit more over on this side as well. Perhaps I'll allow it to build up a bit more, so put it up to about 3%. And just gently bring in a little bit more over here. Maybe just shut down a bit more of the light on this side because I want to focus it a bit more there. A bit more of this darkness over on this side is probably no bad thing. Something like that. Okay, top layer, create another layer. And we're going to stay with the same color, 2% size, 20% opacity, and I'm going to choose my horizon line now. So I'm going to do a line across, hold it till it snaps to a straight line, and then I can just straighten up so that it makes something that I feel is horizontal. If you're struggling to judge whether it's horizontal, you can go to the actions, put on the drawing guide, and if it isn't already set to a grid, you can edit the drawing guide and put it on a 2D grid here, and you can just check that your horizon line is running parallel with one of those lines, which it is, so I'm fine. So then you can go back to the actions and toggle off the drawing guide. So what I'm going to do now is go to my selection tool and rectangle, and I'm going to, from the very corner of my canvas, so that it includes the line I've just created, select the bottom half of my canvas like this. Then I'm going to go back to my brush again, and it doesn't matter now, I can have it at a higher brush setting, so I can put it up to something like 10%, it doesn't really matter. And I can just cut across now a few times and build in that so it really cuts across. Deselect that, and you can see you've got a really nice horizon line now. I will just soften it in a little bit, so I'll go to the adjustments, Gaussian blur, and just do maybe 2% just to make it a bit more subtle. And later on, and if you want to, you can just use that now to maybe bring the cloud and the water just closer together in hue. So you can see I've just kind of blended them in together over on that area. Put it a bit smaller so you can be a bit more precise. So I'll put it about 3%. And I can shut down some of this light over on this side as well. And maybe just trace that across to where I feel that it needs just a little bit more subtlety. Like that. So we have a very clear horizon line now, but it has also softened it in just a little bit so it merges the two elements together. May as well create another layer. It's quite layer intensive, this. Now, if you're limited to the number of layers that you're able to manipulate, you could go back to some of the earlier layers and merge them together. Say for example, layer 3, tap on it, merge down. Layer 4 even, why not? Tap on it, merge down. And you can start to do some of that. It just allows you to continue to add more layers at the very top. Okay, so we're on the 11th layer that we have created during this tutorial, which is now on the top. And I'm going to select pretty much the area that I want to work with again. So similar to what I just did. So I'm going to select it here. Then I think what I might do is go to my colour that I started with right at the beginning, and I'm going to drag and flood fill this whole area, deselect it. And what that allows me to do with that layer by tapping on it is to use alpha lock. Now everything that's on this new layer, which is just that blue rectangle, I can work on without fear that I'm going to go over the edges. So for example, if I was to select this colour, which is third in, and just loosely go over it, you can see it stops dead at that very edge, which is going to be useful for what I'm doing now. So I am going to use this colour, which was third from the top, or third on the top row, with my soft brush. I'm going to put it at 4% size and about 10% opacity, and I'm going to build in some lighter colours over in this area, like so. In fact, I'm going to put that up actually to about 8% size, just to build it down a little bit. We're going to have other elements obviously on this, but we can build some into some of that light. Why not? Doesn't need to be neat. Go back to my colours. I'm going to use this darker blue. So we've got the first blue and this dark blue now, and it's about 5% size and still at the 10-ish% opacity. I can just build in some slightly darker tone too at both sides, so it's really sandwiched that lighter area. Whilst we're still got alpha lock engaged, I'm going to go to the adjustments, Gaussian blur, blur it in to about the 25%. Then I can go to the layer again, tap on it, deselect alpha lock, and I'm also going to blur it now without the alpha lock on just a little bit, so it softens that top edge and makes it less harsh. So I'll go to the Gaussian blur, blur it in to about the 4%, and I feel that's starting to work. I'll go back in and refine some of these features a little bit later too, but I'm going to create another layer, go back to my colours. I'm going to start using the bottom row of colours now, starting with the first colour on the bottom row. I'm going to switch to my airbrush medium brush, turn it to 2% size and about 60% strength opacity. And just on this edge, poking up above that horizon line, which is still discernible, we can just have a land feature that cuts across above the water. Now we don't need to go in any particular detail with this, just getting it in there is important. And add another part to it down here, perhaps to something like this. Then I'm going to have maybe just a breakaway section. So we're getting some just little pieces of land that are not quite submerging in the water. You're going to get some different areas here too. Okay, I'm going to put the brush size to about 4% and the opacity down to about 50%. Stay at the 60% opacity, and I'm just going to build in a lower section here. I'm initially going to do it pretty dark, and we're going to add a lot of highlights over the top. So it doesn't matter if it's very dark, put it up to look more about the 10%. Blot in an area down here. I find it sometimes easier to add light over the top of dark, so I'm just mapping in the shape and then just the shoreline here as well, where the beach or the sand is going to meet the water, so I can just cut that in and don't really worry about it too much. Okay, I'm going to create another layer. With the organic rainforest brush, I'm just going to change to this light green colour, so it's the 6th colour on the bottom row. I'm going to have the brush size at about 2% and the opacity at 30%. And I'm just lightly now going to start tapping some of this texture just at the top area over here. And then I'm going to start bringing it down into this area too, just doing a series of taps initially, just in this region. Then I'm going to put it up to 3% and I'm going to increase the opacity to 50% too. And we can start just doing more of this. And I'll increase it to 5%, keep it at the 50%, and just start doing some more taps too. They get bigger as they get closer to us. And then I'll increase it to 8%. We're just initially getting these grass sort of mounds and blobs spaced in there. So this isn't the texture that you're going to see in the end. I just found it quite a useful way of collecting and building it up. So that isn't the final texture, but I'm going to create a new layer. I'm going to change brush back to my airbrushing medium brush, and I'm going to go for the darker grey colour, second from the right on the bottom row. I'm going to have the brush size at 2% and the opacity at 40%. And in between some of these shapes now, I'm going to start bringing in the sand that's not covered in grass. So we've got some areas that are going to be revealed in the spaces between these grass mounds. And perhaps I'll just increase it slightly to the larger part of 2%, keep it at the 40%. Let's continue just piecing in some of the sand that's being revealed in the gaps. The section there at the top. So we've got a collection of grass mounds that really have bunched together, and there isn't much really of a gap, just a hint of it here and there. And we can alternate between the lowest and the highest part of 2% for how precise we want to be. So if it's in the distance, maybe use the smaller one, smaller end of 2%. And then as we get closer to us, we can increase it back up to the larger part of 2%. Just going in and around some of these gaps. I'm going to add some different textures to this grass anyway, so the edges of these mounds is not particularly important at this point. It was just helping us getting those initial shapes in location, in position. So I'm chipping away probably more so at the top of the mounds and leaving maybe a little bit extra of the dark tone underneath of them. So I'm going to add grass to the top of these individual shapes. So I'm just chipping away at the top of them, but leaving a little bit more of the shadow intact on the underside of them. And I'm just going to have a few breaks, a few gaps, more over here. You don't have to put the gaps exactly where I'm putting them, just like the clouds. With any of these elements, to be fair, you don't have to slavishly copy exactly as I'm showing you. I'm just giving you a general sense, and you can make yours as you will. And then when we come over to this area, I'm actually going to have this as the shore, so the sand. So we'll have this tidied up just slightly, and we'll have this going down in this kind of a motion. And then I'll just trace around the top edge of some of this grass so I can really go into that. And reclaim this area as like a shoreline. Just a little bit of sand just before it meets the water. You can always go back in and continue to add some mounds into this. So just because we remove them now at this point doesn't mean that they've gone forever, doesn't mean we can't add more. I think it's important to put some in initially, very quickly, just so that we can get a sense of it, start to visualize it. I think visualizing it and getting an impression of it is really important, even if it's a very rough version of it, and then you can go in and just refine and add more detail. And I'm not going to show too much of the sand in this lower area. Perhaps just increase it to 3%, a couple more here, because we're going to have longer grass in the foreground anyway, so it's going to largely obscure much of anything that we add to it anyway. Maybe just a hint of it here and there, something like this. Continue to build it up. Just go over this area particularly, because this is where the sand is going to be. I'm just going to reduce the opacity to 15% and just go over this dark colour and just start to subdue that a little bit as well. So just go over that a couple of times. So it's not going to be as dark or as light as the sand rather, but we need to just lighten it up a little bit. Okay, I'm going to create a new layer, layer 13, and I'm going to go to my artistic leatherwood brush, and I'm going to go to this third colour on the bottom row. I'm going to set it to 3% size and about 25% opacity. And I'm just going to bring this colour along this edge and just start to tap in a texture just to rough up some of that edge here along this water line. So the water is here. Not really crashing waves, it's just some bits of texture that are just emerging at the edge of the water. So I'm just chipping away at that edge, just get rid of that softness. Just adding a little bit more texture. So we'll go over it a few times, just tap it in until you're happy that it's starting to look just a little bit better. Maybe just a couple of outlying little pieces too. Something like this. And then for the actual sand bit where it's not quite as wet, because obviously initially we've got an area where the water is lapping a little bit and it makes it darker. So we're going to make a lighter section where it's a bit drier. So I'm going to go for this lighter grey on the end of the bottom row. And just quite simply, I'm going to start bringing that in here. Again, still at 25% and 3% size. And I can just sort of drag it along this way a little bit. And I can just kind of scribble it in. I'm keeping the direction the same, but as long as I do that, I can just go over it a few times, scribble it in a little bit, and really just start to build up the textures here a little bit. I can use a combination of longer brush strokes and taps. I'm pressing quite lightly still. I could just start to build up the impression that there's more textures in this region. Again, you can probably hear a few taps in addition. And I'm just going to go to the Gaussian blur and blur it in just a hint, maybe 3%. I'm going to go back to this third colour in, and I'm just going to create another area up here, perhaps. I'm just going to continue to make a larger area, perhaps where the water is just disappearing away, and just perhaps a little bit more with the third colour on the bottom row, just a little bit more in this area too. Okay, I'm going to go to the Gaussian blur on the under the adjustments and just blur it in just a couple of percent, just take the edges off it. Create another layer, go back to my brushes, probably going to go in with my airbrushing soft brush. It's a brush that I feel very confident with, so I can go back in with this light green again. I'm going to have it at the 2% size and about 40% opacity. And I'm just going to start picking out the top edges of some of these grass mounds. Perhaps I need to just have it on the lowest part of 2%, so it's just really a lot narrower. And just think about the highlights. The light is coming from over there, so it's just going to dust. It's just going to grab the top edge of some of these mounds. So I'm just going in there now and just creating like those kind of shapes. I'll do a closer one so you can see that a bit more. So just tapping in the texture for the top arch of our mound shape. So I could do it in a series of little taps, but I'm just generally creating that shape. So the top edge of it. Again, it isn't overly fussed over. It's more about creating the impression. As with all my tutorials, I don't really zoom in and spend ages doing every blade of grass on a detail like this, but I do help you get to the stage where you can see the foundations and how to build up the effect, and then you can, if you want, just spend longer on those little details and allow it to be something that can be zoomed in a little bit further. But I just want to get you to the point where you can see how to build something like this up. So again, I'm just laying in some of these textures for the grass in the distance, as well as some of these shapes for the foreground. So sometimes you're going to clearly see the top of one of these grass mounds, and other times it's just going to be a collection of smaller highlights that all kind of bunch together and you don't see it very clearly. And other times you do get one that's, especially if it's isolated, and you're going to see the top arch of that mound shape a little bit more clearly. I'm going to probably blur this in a moment anyway, and then we'll go into it with the sketching pencil and just start adding some individual blades of grass just to really pick them out a little bit more. But initially we just need to get those top highlights in place, certainly for the distance and middle distant ones. I'm going to go back a step to the middle of these green colours, so that's the fifth in from the left. I'm going to put it up to 3% size and down to about 20%, and I'm just going to start tidying up or bringing in some of these top edges to the more foreground grass areas. Just need to tidy them up a little bit. We chipped away when we added the gaps, so I just need to go back in and just reclaim them a little bit. And this is a slightly more vibrant green, which makes sense when you get things, objects that are closer to you. You tend to ramp up the colours just a little bit. You bring out the warmth and the saturation of those colours when it gets slightly closer. Again, I'm just softening in some of these textures. We have some slightly rough edges, so I'm just trying to get rid of some of that. Just blending in, softening it in. And we can always reclaim a couple more grass mounds here too. Perhaps we've eliminated a bit too much, so we'll just add a bit more in. Let's put it up to 4%, add a couple more in. Could even go to a darker colour. So I've got this black now, which is on the middle row, and we've got the highlights, and we need to start going in with a smaller brush. I'll start with the lower part of 2% still, and 20% opacity. And I'm just going to start putting in some areas where we really get a strong shadow on some of these. So we've got all the highlights, but you don't want to overdo this, and it's not going to be evenly distributed. It's going to be just sort of randomly here and there, where you just start to get some on the underside, so on the bottom part of the grass mounds. You're just going to start really bringing out the darkness of the shadow. And that's something that when we get closer to us, perhaps we can make larger and really bring out some of this darkness. We're going to go over this, like I say, with a different brush, just to bring out some of these closer to blades of grass. But initially, we're just getting the overall form in place. So that means the light and the dark. So obviously the shadow on this side and then the highlight on top. Once we've got those shapes in, we can go back in. Reduce it back down a bit, just to go into some of these and just make sure that we're starting to make them look a little bit more 3D. Anywhere that's got a clear view of it, you're going to see some of that shadow. Okay, you can see I'm quite randomly just moving around. I'm not sticking one place at a time. I think that's part of the process sometimes, is to almost kind of scattergun the whole thing. Keep moving. It stops you getting too locked into uniformity, something like this. And we're just increasing the effect initially. Now I can go in by creating another layer. Go to my sketching 6B pencil, and I'm going to switch to this light green, which was the 6th colour in from the left. And I just need to find the right size, somewhere around the 30% size, and I'm going to turn it down. I don't want it to be too strong, so about 30% strength as well, opacity. And I'm going to start initially with some of these middle distant mounds of grass. So I can just start going in now and adding some of this texture. I'm going to concentrate predominantly on the bit where the highlights would be. Obviously, we're going to have some of that green cutting in front of the shadows too, but certainly it's going to pick up really strongly in the highlighted areas. So we're adding to the highlight effect, really. And we can just keep moving around, adding more of this effect, building it up, and don't forget to make sure that they overlap in some areas. So I'm going to alternate between the light green and this dark green here. So if I go to the dark green, anywhere where you can really just make out on the edges, you can just start to go into that, and you'll get individual blades of grass that just become noticeable. And obviously it depends how you press on too. We have a mound here that's very noticeable, so we'll just go in and take the time just to add some of that, build it up in layers. So again, alternate between the light and dark. I'm just going to add some more light in. It's about building up the texture, building up the layers. So again, some dark, and then go back in with the light over the top, and then just start to build up that effect. And another feature I can add to this is I go to this colour, which is 4th in from the right, and have the opacity at 70%. And I can just start to add at the top of this grass, you get the little highlights at the top. Add a few of these to the very top, and again, this is part of why it's highlighted, why it looks lighter in the distance. And sometimes you can just add them without actually knowing where the blade is you can just add these into the mix and it really will help with that texture. So again, we can just scatter these into the top of our blades of grass. And it just really helps bring it together. So I'm just going to move across these grass mounds now, continuing to do those three different things. So adding some of the dark blades of grass, adding the light green, and then go in around the top and just add some of these lighter top ends of the blades as well. So they're more noticeable at the very top. So the distant ones, you're hardly going to notice it. Maybe just move to the two light colours here for those, and just, just a hint of it here and there, just to pepper it in. Just a series of dots and dashes will be enough to represent that texture in the distance. The good thing about texture is that really you only need to just represent it kind of in clarity in the foreground, and then as it gets further away, your imagination can fill in those details. Now, don't get me wrong, there's some paintings that will go into those details and every step, and you could zoom in and it's pretty much consistent, but we're creating more of an impressionistic kind of look for this, so I'm not as worried. Okay, I'm just going to go to my adjustments, Gaussian blur, and I'm going to blur it in just slightly, just nudged into the 3%, and it just softens it in. The texture's still pretty much there, but it just softens it slightly. Create another layer. We're going to still use the 6B pencil. I'm going to have it at 50% size and 40% strength, opacity. And I'm initially going to use the green, the light green. And I'm not really going to bother with any darker tones. I'm just going to use this now to bring in some blades of grass. So you can be a bit more controlled with this. Have some blades of grass that sort of bend over. And we really just want to be a bit more precise. Now this pencil, if you press on hard, you're going to get a darker line compared to if you press on lightly. So just be aware of that. Try and keep it a little bit consistent. So I just noticed one there that went too thick. Perhaps some blades of grass that bend this way and other ones that cut across it. We can really start to build up this effect in the more foreground. In addition to that, we can go to this colour, fourth in from the right, and just for the top of those blades of grass, just like we were doing before, press on a bit more. You're going to get these like the seed areas of the top of the grass. And that just really helps with this kind of texture. It just moves the eye away from the individual shapes of the blades of grass and just helps you understand the overall look of it a bit better. So I'll continue doing that, alternating between the green and that light colour. Perhaps I'll go for a dark colour, just in areas perhaps where we do start to see some emptiness. We could just add some darker blades of grass in there as well. I guess it's necessary in one or two places, but not too much. Just perhaps where you would get something that just cuts in front of the lighter contrasting sand. You shouldn't need to do too much of that, just one or two areas maybe. And back to the highlight again, light green, and just start to build up that too. I'm just going to fast forward through this a little bit. Once you start to see how it's done, the overall effect, then you can just start to do it yourself. And it's just a little bit time consuming, so I'm just really trying to get you to understand the effect. Again, with the lighter colour, really have fun playing around with the ends of those blades of grass. This, for me, is the nicest bit of the grass texture, is just adding those top edges. It just really brings it to life. Perhaps turn it down a little bit. If you want to be a bit more controlled, I'll put it down to 30%. Depends how hard you press. So obviously you'll notice I'm changing direction a lot. Obviously it's the ends of grass. You're going to get some clusters where perhaps a whole cluster of it goes in the same direction, but you know, it is an organic element. It's going to go in all sorts of random directions, so try to remember to do that. I'm going to create a new layer on top, and still with the 6B pencil, I put it up to 100% size, keep it at the 40% strength, and I'm just going to have just a few cutting in front of this area. I'm not going to get into the detail of these especially because it's just a little extra touch and don't have to be overly neat, because what I'm going to do now is go to the adjustments, motion blur, and because obviously the grass would just catch the breeze slightly, find a point where it just started to double up a little bit, so about 15% in my instance works. And I can go back to layer 15 and just continue to perhaps turn it down again to about 30%. Just turn the opacity up to about 70% and just continue just to add in any remaining little features to this grass. You see any more gaps in these areas that you just want to add a little bit more. Okay, you can refine and fine tune that kind of grass. I could certainly go into with the different greens and chip away at this bottom edge a little bit with a lower percentage, you know, take away some of the dark areas a little bit more, but take your time, whatever you think works best in your particular image. I think on layer 15, I'm going to go to the adjustments, Gaussian blur, and just blur it in 2% just to soften it in slightly. I find sometimes the actual brush textures are a little bit harsh. Just subduing it with a bit of blur really helps. Top layer, create a layer on top with my airbrushing soft brush, and I'm going to go to first blue that I was using. I'm going to have this at 2% size and quite low on the opacity at around 20%, and I'm just going to start building in some slight ripples in the water as we cut in here. And we notice it in the highlighted area, so perhaps we need to go for the lighter colour too. Second blue, and just bring that effect in here a little bit from this side. We don't need to do too much of this, just a hint, just to build in the suggestion that there's water, waves or ripples coming in to this shore. Perhaps I'll go for the second colour on the bottom row, and same settings, just start to build in another bank area. It's more of an interesting water area here, so you get some shallows and some land that's just bits of sand that's emerging out of the water. And I'll just allow it to break off the texture as it starts to disappear under the water again. Go back in with the first blue that we had, soft brush, 4% size, 20% opacity, and just knock that back a little bit actually. Just subdue it. Feels like it's coming forward a little bit too much. I'm going to go to the lighter colour, which is the fifth colour on the bottom row, reduce it down to 2% size, 20% opacity. And we're just going to start building in some of this around some of these edges. I'm just going to create a contrast of colour around some of these edges and some stripes of this light colour cutting across over here as well. And as well as that, I'm going to go to this dark blue, first dark blue, and I'm going to start cutting that across as well. I think when we've got a darker area here, we need to have darker colours to really bring out the separation between the water and the sky. And we can cut across a little bit, start to bring some of these areas together, just a hint. On the top layer with my dark blue colour, fourth in from the right, that's the lower part 2% and 20% strength. I'm just going to continue adding in some of these kind of ripple suggestions over on this side really. This is the foreground kind of water area, so you're going to notice the disruption, the ripples in the water a little bit. They are waves, but really quite subtle. I'll just put the opacity to 40% and down to 1% size. I feel like I just need to sharpen it up on the top line, so just try and match it as much as you can. It's going to be wobbly and that's fine, but then you just snap and hold it to that line just to really crisp and sharpen that up. I'm going to turn that down to about 15% size, or opacity rather, and I'll just go over to this side of the horizon, do a line to over here, join it up like so, switch to my paler blue and maybe just another line across, do another line the 1% like that, snap it to a straight line and do that again. I think a few just horizontal lines there really just creates a variety of stripes and bands that cut across. I need to bring some of the warmth from the sky down into the water. I'm going to go to my layers, create another layer, change the normal blend mode to the add, stay on the soft brush, but I'm going to go for the red colour on the middle row, 2% size, 15% opacity, and I'm just going to lightly nudge in some of this pink now, so it's drawing down some of the colours. There's obviously a strong influence in the sky, so it really should impact the water a bit more as well. You don't really need to go overboard with that, just some suggestions of it, some bands, build it up somewhat perhaps, just a little bit more, just so it is noticeable, it's not too subtle, and then it can, like I say, kind of play in and around the edges of these floating shapes too. Turn that up to about 3% size and even further down to about 5% opacity, and I can just perhaps just build on a little bit more of a glow, generally a bit more diffused, joining in around here. When I look back on the warm layer, which was this layer here, layer 7, but also layer 8, if I want to go to layer 8, create another layer on top, and with the soft brush, with this red colour, put it up to about 8% and about 5% opacity, and I just feel like I want to go into that area and ramp up the warmth a little bit there actually. I feel like it was a little bit too subtle, and you can always just judge it if you feel like it's gone too much. You can go to the end symbol and you can dial that back and experiment. So I feel that nothing, it's not enough, and you can just really gauge how much intensity you want. So I'm going to put it at about 50% actually, and I think that works. I feel also like the contrasting clouds in that area, which was the layer above it, layer 9. I'm going to slide and duplicate just to ramp those up. So I now can just merge them together to reduce the layers. So layer 9 merged down, so it now becomes one layer again. And again, I feel like it's just intensified some of these effects. I feel if I go back to layer 6, using the organic rainforest brush, change my colour to this colour, which is the 5th along, set down to about 3% size and low at about 15% strength, opacity. Maybe just add in a few lighter highlights in the background just to add a subtler mix in there as well. Some slightly warmer colours, and even from there I could add a bit of white on the same layer, same idea. Bring some of that influence in just so it's not so flat looking at the very top, and bring some of that in more. I think just in the sand area generally, so wherever that is, so where are we? Layer 12, go onto that layer, using this soft brush, go for the lighter grey, turn it down to 2% size and about 30% strength, and I can just start piecing in some extra textures in this sand area just to add a little bit of lighter touch here and there. And I can also use it, it's really quite advantageous to just clip off the bottom some of these sand mounds. The sand will pile up on the back edge sometimes, and just you won't see where the grass is actually growing from. And if you feel that you know some of the grass is too much above that, then you can always go up to a higher layer, so maybe layer 16, And you can just continue to do that, and that way it will just, you get an idea that you're really just clipping off the bottom edge of some of these grass tufts. Add a few more points of texture, and maybe just a little bit more on the beach, on the sandy bits here as well. Now we did use the leatherwood brush before, but I'm just controlling it a little bit more now, so I'm just tapping in, fine-tuning. I could spend a lot longer, I could zoom in more like I was explaining before, just to really fine-tune this, but I'm just going to do it quite subtly and leave it at that. I am going to go in with a much darker colour, this dark colour second from the left, and maybe just add some darker textures just so you create some contrast in there as well. So you get the variety of textures, I think that will work better. And then maybe in this sort of band that cuts down here, I can just tap in some subtle textures in there as well. Just a series of dashes and dots predominantly, just to sharpen up the impact of that. Okay, if you've enjoyed watching this tutorial, please make sure to hit the thumbs up and the subscribe, and don't forget the bell notification to make sure you are notified of all my future videos too. Thanks for watching, catch you back here soon. Bye for now.